And now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Christopher Stuart Taylor, who is an author, public servant, and educator. Christopher will be presenting on confronting racism toward immigrants to Canada, links to the past and future prospects. And you'll find his full bio note in the conference schedule. I've known Christopher for over 10 years since he was a graduate student at Western University, and I am so proud to have him as our keynote speaker today. Just before I turn things over to Christopher, I would like to remind you that we will be using Slido to field questions after his presentation. And now, over to you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Dr. Esses. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. Thank you, Fraser. Thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate it. So, where are we? Where do we begin? Under the yoke of enslavement, colonial domination, poverty, and racism, the pride and industry of a people was born. The epitome of human capitalist greed and disregard for human life, the transatlantic slave trade, and the institution of enslavement laid the foundation for the creation of Black peoples in the Americas. Europeans perfected a system of ideological genocide. They attempted to destroy the self, the being, and the existence of the quote unquote African, and created its new being as property. It was a legalized system needed not for the survival and welfare of European societies, but to provide a luxury for those ignorant to its origins and amass wealth for the few, shielded a continent away from the brutality they created. The trade was designed to exploit and to profit. It was not a symbiotic relationship. Quote unquote Africans, now enslaved in the Americas, did not enter into a binding employment contract with paid wages and benefits. Phenotypic terrorists broke, castrated, and raped their bodies and destroyed, attempted to destroy their existence. The institution was a calculated act of terrorism against humanity and human dignity. The Americas were not the land of quote unquote freedom, as what they're perceived to be now, but a theater of war where the enemy disguised itself under a cloak of lies, greed, and violence. Welcome to our history of racism, specifically anti-Black racism. For those who are Black in this country and for Black newcomers across the Americas. So what? Why did I begin with that introduction? This conference is focusing on immigration, newcomers, and resettlement in a time of a pandemic and toward a racism and discrimination-free Canada. We're having these conversations today in a pandemic within a pandemic. My goal is to encourage people to think about the impact of racism, specifically anti-Black racism and discrimination towards newcomers, specifically Black newcomers in Canada. And what are some of the challenges and opportunities for change now and in the near future? And so the big question that we have is, how do we think about this question and these questions that are happening throughout this conference in this time of a pandemic within a pandemic? As folks are very well aware of, yes, we are in the COVID-19 pandemic, but as what has been highlighted to all of us since May 25th, 2020, we are within this pandemic of anti-Black racism, white supremacy. And as Fraser mentioned, and these conversations are going on, how do you reconcile that during this COVID-19 pandemic, there's also a strong call for more newcomers? But then how do we reconcile that? Understanding that we are within this anti-Black racism pandemic. Why are we not acknowledging and addressing systemic and individual acts of racism against Blacks, Indigenous peoples, and other quote unquote non-whites, as this is a real barrier to inclusion? These are the questions that we must ask ourselves as we navigate these spaces. As we're trying to answer these questions, yes, we are within the COVID-19 pandemic, but how are we understanding settlement? How are we understanding white supremacy and anti-Black racism, how it specifically relates to newcomers, particularly racialized newcomers, especially Black newcomers? And I'm glad Fraser opened with a land acknowledgement. And one of the things that particular scholars, quote unquote activists in these spaces now as well, are getting into what we call a Black body acknowledgement, or a Black body and humanity acknowledgement. And there's a term from leader, scholar, activist Anthony Morgan called displanted. That when referring to Black peoples, particularly in Canada, that we have been displanted, displaced from the African continent due to the transatlantic slave trade, or as I like to call, the human trafficking of Black bodies. And then we've been planted within this settler colonial state known as Canada. And within this Black body acknowledgement, we need to understand that there's folks who are on this call today, who are attending this conference and listening in, that there are a lot of folks that are coming with a lot of pain and trauma, particularly as it relates to anti-Black racism. That this isn't something that is happening out there. This is something that's happening to them. When they're on their social media feeds, it is a mirror to their own mortality. And that's one of the things that we must understand and we must contextualize as policymakers, as academics, as educators, as scholars, as community workers, that how are we reconciling this space of settler colonialism, of anti-Black racism, of white supremacy? How are we reconciling this understanding that, yes, while we're trying to have a inclusive and racism-free, quote unquote, settlement service, how do we reconcile that within this space of white supremacy? What does this mean for Black newcomers? When they come here, when their Blackness means something very different and their transnational habitus becomes irrelevant. When they come and are trying to settle under a banner where their skin color, their phenotype has immediately become a pathology, negative, bad. How do we have those conversations with newcomers in settlement to say, hey, you are now Black? What? What's that? You are now subject to the centuries of anti-Black racism, which has formed and formalized and negatively reduced people of your skin color to lesser than? How do we tell newcomers that in Canada, you are Black first? Full stop, period. These are the questions that we must address as we move forward. So why me? Why am I here today delivering this keynote? I approach my work through a diachronic and targeted universalism approach. That yes, while I focus on Canada's history of anti-Black racism and treatment of Black people and Black newcomers, I do this in a way to address the systems that can improve the conditions for all newcomers. And one piece I'm going to get to in our keynote, I always want to reframe this particularly around the domestic scheme. That there are untold stories that we must think of and we must address when it comes to how Black peoples, particularly the intersections of Black women from the West Indies, how through their efforts and their work have shifted, particularly after 1955, has shifted the space of immigration and settlement in this country for all peoples, not just Black folks, but for all peoples. So I always like to think through prisms of critical race theory, of Black feminist thought and theory. I always think about it through lived experience, personal experience, academic experiences, through doxa, popular opinion, through praxis, through my experiences as an academic and a policymaker. How do we blend these two avenues together? This is why I really appreciate the work that Dr. Esses has been doing here, particularly with this conference, that we're bringing in thinkers together to have this common goal and this common approach. And one of the big things that I do, particularly in my work and in this keynote, as you're going to see and hear, I take a Pan-African approach, a global Blackness approach, and how we can take some of these tools that we've learned from across the globe to make change here. And some big questions I want folks to think about this morning. We're in a space that we're referring to settlement in Canada. And a question I want to ask folks, what does quote unquote contemporary Canada mean to you? What does Canada look like to you? And as Fraser mentioned, yes, in this nation state, we're trying to move away from the settlement of newcomers, particularly in larger cities. But is that Canada? Is that contemporary Canada? So I want you to think about that. I want you to sit with that. I also want us to think about settler colonialism. How do we engage with this term, settlement, when the term itself reinforces the ongoing attempts at colonization of Indigenous peoples? How? How do we reconcile the 1962 deracialization of Canadian immigration policy, the 1967 implementation of the point system, the 1971 push of the multiculturalism policy, with Chrétien's 1969 white paper. How do we reconcile all these pieces when the term itself of settlement and settling and integration have been used historically? Again, I'm coming from these diachronic realities, have been used historically to create a system of lateral violence and oppression Olympics, which continues to marginalize and exclude indigenous peoples. We are in a settler colonial state. So when we use the term settlement, how do we reconcile that we are effectively agents of white supremacy? How? I also want us to think about the intersectional and global systems of oppression. The Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Net recently published an article on confronting systemic racism globally. And they mentioned, quote, "We are in a political economy of violence, where those that benefit from capitalism and those that suffer its consequences are the same people that benefit and suffer the consequences of racism and state violence." Are we engaging with these conversations? Are these top of mind when we say, yes, we want to address and challenge racism, racial discrimination, anti-Black racism? But are these tack-on initiatives? Do we take this from a position that, yes, we are going to make sure that we are more culturally sensitive, quote unquote, that we are much more culturally fluent? But does it address this political economy, this global political economy of violence, state violence, racism, and capitalism? Are we engaging with these conversations? Are we addressing these conversations? And if we do, what are we doing with it? And one thing I want us to focus on and think about, particularly when we're addressing systems, systemic racism, systemic violence, that while what I'm saying might seem bleak, we all have spheres of influence. And from a good friend and colleague of mine, Kika Ojo, she has coined a term called a posture of practice versus a posture of perfection, where she states as leaders, and I argue that we all have spheres of influence, no matter where we are on the hierarchical chart of any organization, that do we have the ability to listen to those questions that I pose, particularly the question about settler colonialism and the fact that we are trying to focus on settlement is actually reinforcing these barriers and anti-Indigenous racism and colonization. The term itself, settlement, when we hear that term, are we coming from a position and a posture of practice where we're saying, oh, okay, I never thought of it that way. What can we do about it? Let's listen, let's question, let's have more conversations. What can we do? What can we do to circumvent, navigate, destroy, challenge, and confront even the language that we use in these particular spaces? So that's as if we're coming with a posture of practice. And within that, do we have the humility to know that, wow, yes, we are trying to address racism, but this idea and this concept and this system of racism runs so deep in our society, it makes us who we are. It frames the way we think about, quote unquote, settlement and integration. Do we come with the 3 I's of inclusive leadership, introspection, understanding who we are in the spaces that we come into and come from? Do we have the intentions? We are talking the talk at this conference this year. But when these conversations are done, do we get into the 3rd I, the integration/implementation space to make these changes? That is the hard part. And I always like to come back to a quote from James Baldwin in this space. As he states in his book, The Fire Next Time from 1962, quote, "To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger." Again, to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. I want us to think about that. I want us to sit with that. And I also want us to sit with, and that's why I'm coming back to our space and this fundamental question that I asked about settler colonialism that is framed around white supremacy. That is what we are dealing with. Not white supremacists, but we're dealing with white supremacy. And as scholar Francis Lee Ansley argued, quote, "By white supremacy, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread. And relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings," end quote. So yes, we have seen, particularly during this COVID-19 pandemic, the rates of anti-Chinese racism have risen significantly. The numbers are there. The data is there. Yes, we have seen, particularly in Ontario and the GTA, Islamophobia, the acts of violence, deaths have risen. Yes, we've been made aware of the anti-Black racism, which is pervasive around and within all our institutions, particularly around policing, where the conversation has sat. But have we engaged with the understanding that what we are seeing are symptoms? That racism and privilege are symptoms, but white supremacy is the disease. Are we engaging with that conversation? And I'll add to that piece there that when we talk about settlement and when we talk about the exclusion and marginalization and the racism that has come up for some and for others has always been in the top of mind and top of their consciousness. Have we tied these ideas with Canada explicitly, particularly in the late 19th century, mid-20th century, been designed to be a, quote, white man's country? Have we engaged with that history? Have we engaged with that diachronic reality? Have we sat with it? Moreover, have we connected this idea of settlement, this procedure and practice and policy of settlement can be perceived, and this is coming from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's definition of racism, that it can be perceived as a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity and are substantiated by racist ideas. This concept of settlement within the structures of settler colonialism and supported by a system of white supremacy. Have we engaged with that space? And so folks will ask, wow, okay, that's a lot. And this is where I specifically want to use anti-Black racism, as I mentioned, in my approach of targeted universalism, and in this case, as a case study to what we've seen historically in terms of racism and discrimination of Black newcomers, but also what we've seen historically and how to challenge this, and how this focus on anti-Black racism and Black newcomers has actually been a space that has opened up this country, literally and figuratively, to all newcomers, Black, white, and purple. And so I want us to level set with the definition of anti-Black racism from the Confronting Anti-Black Racism units from the city of Toronto, their definition of anti-Black racism. So, quote, anti-Black racism is policies and practices that are embedded in Canadian institutions that reflect and reinforce beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and or discrimination that are directed at people of African descent and are rooted in the unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization here in Canada. Again, that are directed at people of African descent and are rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement and colonization here in Canada. There's a reason why I opened up this keynote with that passage describing the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Again, as I like to refer to, one of the largest historical movements of human trafficking that we have seen. Upwards of 15 million bodies, people, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, millions who never made it. Millions whose names and histories were erased and legally defined as property, which have created these realities and dangers of what we've been seeing since May 25th, 2020. So if we do not engage with this history of the transatlantic slave trade, and if we don't engage with this history and understanding that the uniqueness of anti-Black racism in this country comes from the unique experience of enslavement and colonization here in Canada, this is not a quote unquote American problem. This is specific to Canada. So we need to understand that our solutions, yes, while they can be influenced from those across the Americas, our solutions must come from within in Canada. We must also understand this historical background of anti-Black racism in Canada. We must sit with and understand that the first race riot in North America was right here, Shelburne, Nova Scotia, 1784. And even if we take a settlement lens to this, again, I come from the space of diachronic realities. Even if we come with a settlement lens to this, this was from the cause of this race riot, 1784, Black loyalists who were promised land, viable land, agricultural land, from fighting for the British. But it never happened. And so they had to work But because of the system of white supremacy and anti-Black racism and these negative codifications of Blackness, that Black meant, quote unquote, enslaved, they were paid less money, fewer dollars. And the larger white population got mad. They're like, wait a second. You're taking jobs away from us. You're stealing our jobs. And I always like to use that example because how can we see those parallels of what we've been seeing when it comes to settlement of quote unquote non-white newcomers in this space? They're quote unquote stealing our jobs. This is not new. This is as old as Canada. This predates 1867 Canada. And again, I want us to start thinking about how what we see and perceive, particularly for those who may not be Black newcomers, how this has been rooted in the settlement of Black people in this country. Again, we need to situate this and understand that enslavement existed in this country until 1834. What would become, I should say, Canada, 1834. And within this prism of settlement, of newcomers, and migration, all of us are very well aware that this is tied to economies. This is tied to capitalism. As we see, we need this country, we need more newcomers. We do, to make sure our economy survives and grows. But again, when we look at these structures, do we understand that this idea of growth and capitalism and markets is essentially racist? Capitalism is racist and racism is capitalist. So are we disaggregating these two pieces? Are we saying, okay, well, we are really looking at the economy and how many people we need, and we're going to bring folks in, but even using that lens, that framework, that reasoning, it is confounding racism. It is perpetuating racism. And not just for Black folks, for all quote unquote non-white newcomers. So how do we reconcile that? I'm always coming back to this question. How do we reconcile that? Again, how do we reconcile that our immigration policies, particularly in the early to mid 20th century, particularly after 1906 and 1910 immigration acts, highlighted by the 1911 Order in Council, that effectively created a net negative migration of Black peoples until 1962 through climate discrimination, that it is too cold for Black people to settle here. This pseudoscience of race that was so pervasive in the 19th century shunned, excluded Black peoples. And the folks will argue, well, you know what, that ended in 1962. Then we had the point system, which is quote unquote fair. Is it? Meritocracy, is that fair? The amount of points you get, is that fair? Or do we need to reconstruct our understanding of meritocracy itself across our society and not just within quote unquote settlement services? That meritocracy itself is a foundation and functions through the prisms and supported by white supremacy. It is subjective. It is not real. It's a category to exclude and justify the exclusion of peoples that do not quote unquote fit the ideal models of what a quote unquote Canadian should or shouldn't be. So are we reconciling with those questions? Are we looking at our histories to say, yes, we think we've moved past that 1967, 1976, we've made these changes. But have these ideologies shifted? Have we gone back and looked particularly at our mid-20th century immigration policies, immigration shifts, and have we centered Blackness? Have we centered how in 1955 with the domestic scheme, Black women, highly educated, became what I have termed immigrant ambassadors to begin to shift these concepts of the negativity of Blackness and show that they can succeed in this country? Are we engaging with that form of resistance, that form of confronting anti-Black racism? And we get into a space where even by us asking these questions and engaging with these epistemologies, with these ways of knowing, with these structures, that I always want to come back to James Baldwin. Because if you truly want to be anti-racist and confront racism, we need to sit with this quote. That quote, "Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality." Well, the Black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. So what do we do with that? How do we acknowledge that we have the small p and big P power and spheres of influence to continue to shake these foundations? That we have the power to understand that even the systems that we work within, that we attempt to make changes, that we attempt for folks to integrate into, assimilate to, settle within, that we are coming from the understanding that we are also, and in fact, agents of white supremacy. And for us to be truly anti-racist and truly focus on addressing these structural and systemic issues that support the essentialist reductions of Black peoples and other non-white peoples, quote unquote, is in fact reinforcing white supremacy. What do we do with that knowledge? What do we do with the realization that yes, while we are attempting to make these spaces much more equitable and bring in more people, support more people, but that this process itself perpetuates racism, perpetuates and supports white supremacy. And one of the things that I've been grappling with, particularly in my space when working as a senior policy advisor in the government of Ontario and the Anti-Racism Directorate, I used to sit with this question all the time. I'm like, I work within a system, I have this academic and scholarly background, these theoretical approaches, but there's got to be a different way. And understanding the limits and constraints of bureaucracy and bureaucratic systems, I sat back and I said, you know what? Maybe we can be racial conduits. And the term I coined, a racial conduit, is us sitting back and saying, yes, first of all, we understand our positionality. We understand who we are. We understand the systems that we work within. We understand that this term settlement reinforces settler colonialism, which is anti-Indigenous racism, which is a continued attempt at colonization of Indigenous peoples in what used to be known as Turtle Island. So once we have that understanding as a racial conduit, we understand our power within that space. We understand that sometimes we may be asking the wrong questions. We have the best intentions, but we may be asking the wrong questions that are leading to the wrong answers. And as that racial conduit, we can sit back, see how these systems reinforce and perpetuate racism. Take a pause. And then while we're there, we can open the doors for folks who can come in to make that change, who can ask those different questions, who can allow for people to think outside the box, who can become radical, who can think of this terms of radical inclusion, that maybe we need to try something that has never been done before. So again, I want us to think. I want us to question who we are, what we're doing, and how this may or may not shift and push towards a racism-free society. Thank you.
Please use Slido to submit your questions and also to vote on questions already submitted. Maybe we could just give Chris a second to breathe. And then we'll go on to the first question. So Christopher, if not settlement and integration, what terms would you suggest?
That's one that I've been grappling with ever since I left Western, I was gonna say University of Western Ontario, but Western University. These are questions I've been asking myself is, you know what, in theory, if we're coming from a good space that settlement, just means how we're going to settle, literally and figuratively, newcomers into this space is fine. But at the same time, if we're using that same understanding of settlement being settlement under the pretense of broken treaties that are continuing to exclude and marginalize Indigenous peoples, maybe there's a different term that we can use. Maybe it can be a term that we've liked to coming back, for example, with Indigenous peoples, that we are trying to fit folks within the two-row wampum relationship of Indigenous peoples. That we're not trying to settle, we are trying to create more treaty people. And teaching and educating newcomers into the space about treaties, about the two-row wampum relationship. Maybe that's a term that we should use, possibly. And integration itself, I know that's a highly debated term because integration actually means assimilation. And in the space that we are in Canada, where you can be whomever you want to be, these hyphenated identities, are we really integrating people to be whomever they want, or are we integrating people to fit within a white supremacist society? So these are questions that we can really ask.
Thank you. Christopher, what advice would you give to Black staff who are in the sector and are currently living through career social isolation for having spoken up on racism in the sector?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And one of the things, particularly when I speak to quote unquote Black groups, is that we are dealing with a lot of PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome. We are dealing with a lot of cultural trauma. And the fact for us to speak up, for a lot of us, it's career limiting. That if you speak up and you speak out, it's like, oh, you're going to be the angry Black, insert your gender identity here. And so one of the things that I say is like, look, how can we reframe the conversation away from, and this is where I speak to, larger non-Black groups too, to say that this isn't a Black and white issue. This is a people issue. And if we're truly about, again, quote unquote, settlement of newcomers, you don't need that one Black person to speak up. Hence why, again, when I really push into this conversation of white supremacy, I say, look, white supremacy isn't a Black issue. White supremacy actually reinforces the exclusion of many white people too. So if we're trying to be a much more, again, quote unquote, inclusive space, white people need to sit and see their colleagues, or Black colleagues in particular, speaking up and saying, wait a second, this isn't all on Christopher. I'm going to jump in there and speak too. So again, it's one of those case-by-case situations that you really need to ask yourself, you know what, am I really willing to risk it all? And some people are, and myself personally, I am, but I'm never going to push somebody to say, hey, you Black person, you need to speak up, you need to do everything, because I don't know your life circumstances. I don't know your personal circumstances.
So the next question is, I think, really important, and it is, how can the sector have honest, hard conversations when 99% of the leadership and funders are still overwhelmingly white or white passing, especially in small and medium communities?
Great question. And this is where I was coming back to. Racism is illogical. Racism is so illogical that it just boggles my mind. And particularly when I get into a space having conversations of white supremacy. There's a fantastic book by Metzl, Metzl, that his book is written on. It's called Dying of Whiteness. And what he does, and particularly in the States, the Midwest after the 2016 election or prior to the 2016 election, he went around looking and, engaging with people in the Midwest and saying, you folks have voted against your self-interest to support this idea of whiteness. So again, you really focus on education, gun control, and healthcare. And so one of the things that I do, particularly in these spaces about, somebody asked, how do we really get to these white folks who may be 99% quote unquote white in these small, medium centers? You need newcomers to survive. You need newcomers for growth. And if folks have been ignoring that, we've seen how the numbers have dropped significantly during this pandemic. For economic growth, you need newcomers. Where are newcomers coming from? Non-white spaces. So whether you want to be racist or not, you are going to cut off your nose to spite your face. And if you're willing to do that, kudos to you. So I kind of shift it back to, look, this is where the world's at. You need newcomers for growth. You need newcomers to keep the lifestyle that you've been trying to push for. So it's a win-win for everyone. And that's why I always come back to this racism thing. It's so illogical, it's mind-numbing.
Christopher, can one really do anti-racist work within structures and institutions that reinforce the liberal multicultural narrative within a settler colonial state?
3 years ago, I asked myself that exact same question. I was sitting in the anti-racism directorate and I was like, what am I doing? I've been hired to be anti-racist, create anti-racism programs, particularly as it related to ARC, is what we call the Anti-Racism Competency Capacity Building Program. That was my portfolio. And I sat there and I said, wait a minute. Anti-racism is fundamentally about changing and challenging structures. And I was like, wait a minute, but I'm actually working within that system and structure. So I'm trying to dismantle and upset the hand that feeds me. And I almost had this existential crisis. right? I almost had this existential crisis. I was like, wait, so how, what am I doing? And then I really kind of reframed it around the shift from anti-racism to racial equity. That while the end game is to fundamentally change the structures, in this case, about settlement of newcomers, immigration systems, so on and so forth. But in the immediate space, it's how am I, as Christopher Taylor in X year, trying to make this space much more equitable for people to survive and live within, to live, survive, and thrive. So I kind of had to shift that narrative in my own space, with the long game being to have an anti-racist agenda. And I really kind of frame it around, again, for the historians on the call, I reframe it around the abolition of arguments that, yes, we want emancipation, but step one, we need to get the abolition of the slave trade, 1807. Yes, it took nearly another 30 years for the end of institution of slavery, 1833/34, 1861, 63, 65, depending on who you ask in the States, 1880s if you're looking in Brazil, but we needed to get to that space of ending the slave trade first.
So I think this is a really important question, and it has to do with how we balance acknowledging immigrant and refugee strengths and contributions. We often talk in economic terms, without relying on the language of capitalism and white supremacy.
I struggle with that myself. I'm being very open and transparent here that there is not one quote unquote right answer. And the reason why I bring that up is that there's always a rhetoric in space that newcomer, the singular newcomer community singular wants the same thing. The singular Black community singular wants the same thing. But we also got to understand, particularly when I shape my questions and I shape my epistemologies, my research, my praxis, I understand it in this global Blackness, this Pan-African Blackness, that because I sit here as Christopher Taylor challenging and confronting, capitalism and white supremacy, doesn't mean there's a large cohort of others who may look exactly like me who want to live within this space. So when the question came up about how do I balance it, I balance it about being transparent to say, look, we need to run some parallel systems here. We need to say, there's some people who want to live within this space. Capitalism frames our world, period. Full stop. White supremacy frames our world, full stop. And who am I to demonize anybody or anyone who doesn't want to live within this space? So I wish I can give you a clear-cut answer there, but it's just gonna be one of those things is that we're conscious of it. We're doing this deliberately, where we know what we're bringing people into, and we can give them the choice.
So the next question is whether we should be including ethnicity in our intake forms, and whether it's fair to those that may come from a country that has Black communities. Should we just remove this?
Very, very, very good question. And that's why I opened up and said throughout the talk that, or alluded to at least during the talk, that when you come here to North America, Canada specifically, you become Black. You become Black. My family's from Barbados. Blackness is very different in Barbados. Who and what is Black is very different. The West Indies, South America, Brazil in particular, the African continent, Blackness is very different. And so for some, it's, well, why am I going to put my name on this? That's all of a sudden going to reduce me to this one thing of a quote unquote North American Black person. And these negative codifications of what it means to be quote unquote Black in North America. So you need to sit with the question that, some people may not even understand why to put that there, and others might be vehemently against it. And I say this all the time, particularly when we look at race-based data collection in Indigenous communities. Folks like, we need more data in Indigenous communities. But historically, when we look at race-based data collection in Indigenous communities and tracking in Indigenous communities, historically, it has been used to continue to marginalize and exclude Indigenous peoples. So it's going to be one of those balancing acts to say, hey, why are we doing it? And how are we effectively communicating to people? This is why we're collecting race or ethnicity on your intake forms.
Thank you for that. The next question asks about subtle forms of racism, and it basically says, it's the subtle things that reinforce racism, the micro behaviors, the microaggressions, etc. How do we confront those issues?
I love this question because I always come back to, I don't know where I was and I watched, oh man, this had to be from like one of those videos from the 70s or the 80s. And then in my research after following that, I was looking at, particularly in the Caribbean, where this might seem like a micro behavior when it comes to settlement. One of the questions that they had, particularly in the 50s, mid to late 50s, was where are we going to put a Canadian immigration center in the Caribbean? And they're like, okay, let's put one in Jamaica, maybe Trinidad, but let's have one in the entire Caribbean, which might seem like, you know, an economical place to go, right? We just need one, the Caribbean, the population is not that big. So it might seem like a micro behavior, but in reality, it is a aggressive behavior to exclude Black peoples. Because I don't know how many people on this conference or on this call have been to the Caribbean, but you can't swim from one island to the other. You just can't get in a boat and row yourself from Grenada to Trinidad or Grenada to Jamaica. It can't happen. And so one of the things that I always come down to, that these aren't really micro behaviors when it comes to settlement. These are sometimes conscious but unconscious behaviors that have been ingrained in us, because when we think about white supremacy, I got to pause on this. When we think about white supremacy, we always think about it as being deliberate actions. We always think about it as deliberate acts of racism. But a lot of the times it's just the way we operate and have been accepted to operate in our society. So even us thinking about Blackness, when the idea of Blackness comes to mind, what are we thinking? When the idea of someone from Ethiopia or Eritrea comes to mind, what are we thinking of? As opposed to someone who's coming from Wales, Poland. So this is where I wanted us to confront is to, and I always come that for kids, right? When we talk to kids, like you're in the playground, and they say, you know what, before, well, pre-pandemic playground, they're like, before you're about to, you know, fight that kid in the playground, pause and count to 10. So one of the things, particularly when it comes to micro behaviors or unconscious bias or implicit bias, I tell folks, look, before we act on something, let's pause. Think about where our answer and our reaction is going to come from. That's how we can begin to confront these issues.
Christopher, if white supremacy is a disease, what would be the cure? Or can we assume that we can find a cure?
Man, I should put, I'm wondering if I put my academic hat on or my policy hat on. So the policy hat is, well, you know, this has come from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, that, you know, really, if we think about racism, systemic racism, white supremacy, is that it's a collection of racist policies that reinforce racial inequity and are substantiated by racist ideas. So what we could do is begin to enforce anti-racist policies that will create racial equity and will be supported by anti-racist ideas of people. Simple, right? That's a policy cap. But when I put on my academic hat, I'm like, ooh, we need to essentially change our entire system. We need to start over. Right? We need to just say, okay, you know what? You know, when when you call IT and IT is like, did you turn off your computer? Did you restart it so it fixes a problem? Maybe that's what we need to do. And the thing though is that I always got to pause on that to say, are we really striving, so what? Are we really striving for an anti-racist society, or are we striving for a much more equitable society for people of all races? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'll say it right there. There's nothing wrong with that. Because if we are striving for an equitable society for newcomers, non-white newcomers, Black newcomers, the system can stay as it is. But how are we going to begin to unpack these racist policies to create anti-racist policies to make change?
What advice would you give to IRCC on developing deliberate and actionable anti-Black racism policy and practice?
Step one, I would say you need a anti-racism impact assessment. So again, here's my policy cap. So you need to look at all policies, practices, and procedures, lay them out with a lens to anti-Black racism. Step one. Once you've done that, you've identified the systemic barriers. Now you need to have barrier removal. But the problem is that it takes time, and you need experts who are well-versed in understanding and identifying anti-Black racism within policies, practices, and procedures. It's not as if I'm just going to pick up, a document and say, oh, you excluded Black people. There is not a dearth of folks who are educated in these spaces. So I'm going to give a plug to Dr. Esses, Vicky, and Mayor. That program, that center, has trained folks like myself to be able to have this praxis ability to look at policy and have this academic lens to it and combine the two. So I think step one there is to have an anti-racist impact assessment. Some people call it an anti-racist framework or an audit, whatever term you want to use. But step one is that once you identify them, bring those folks in, then you can begin to make those changes.
So following up on this question, to move towards a more radical inclusion, what role does HR play, and how do we get HR on board?
So full disclosure, I also used to work in HR, so full disclosure. HR typically I shouldn't say this. HR has seen as the space that brings people in, the hiring and whatnot. That's what it seemed to be. But HR plays such a fundamental role in terms of how people are included and respected within institutions. So HR can't be the tack on. If there's going to be any true anti-racist initiative, it just can't be from policymakers. It needs to be embedded from the get-go. Again, a collective impact approach. Again, for the policy folks here, a collective impact approach that everybody from step one is included in, okay, what is our end goal to make these changes? HR included.
So Christopher, how do you see multiculturalism fitting into the anti-Black racism framework?
I haven't used that term in a while. Multiculturalism. This is good. So multiculturalism. Here's the thing, right? And I'm looking at some of the questions here as well. That race is an umbrella term, right? Race is an umbrella term, and there are many different Black cultures, quote unquote, within the Black race. There are many different Black ethnicities within the quote unquote Black race. So one of the things that we kind of really sit with in multiculturalism is that Black is a culture fitting within these different cultures. But if we reframe this idea and concept of multiculturalism to work within races, so this intra multiculturalism, we can begin to understand that there's not one single Black story. There's not one single Black community. There are going to be Black folk, again, like myself in this keynote today, saying, yes, we need to dismantle, deconstruct, and challenge white supremacy. But there's other folks saying, well, maybe we need to work within it. We have newcomers who are coming to these spaces who are coming from much more dire circumstances. And they're saying to me, Christopher, what's the issue with policing? What's the issue with white supremacy? No, we're good here in this space. There are Black folks who vote conservative. There are Black folks who vote liberal. There are Black folks who don't vote at all. So I think if we kind of reframe multiculturalism not to be, this interracial concept, but this idea that cultures exist within races, I think we can kind of really start unpacking what Black needs are for many Black communities, plural.
Christopher, this may be a difficult question. How can we support anti-racism in organizations that are funded and measured through racist colonial systems, developed and supported through white supremacy?
Well, that's a great question. That's why I sat there again. You have these realizations when you're sitting down working on something. You're like, wait a minute, light bulb. And one day I sat there, engaging in this concept of white supremacy. And I said, I'm an agent of white supremacy. I am. And I still sleep well at night. And the reason why I sleep well at night is because I understand I'm a part of a system. I'm conscious of it. and my actions are very deliberate within it. And so it's really hard, particularly when we talk about financial support. Do you cut off your nose to spite your face type of situation? Or do you reframe it to say, look, I know this is a white supremacist organization. I get it. But my sphere of influence is going to support a family to get out of a situation and live a better life. That's the question I ask myself. My individual actions around people, that maybe this might be bad for my intellectual consciousness, but on a practical space, that's why I really like working with policy workers in outside the ivory tower, that we're dealing with real people, right? With real people in real lives. That sometimes we need just to swallow that intellectual conversation and be like, look, people need to eat, full stop. So what are we going to do about that?
I think this is probably our last question, and maybe it has a bit of a more optimistic tone to it, but how can we include children to be future ambassadors for anti-racism?
Oh, fantastic. Kids are already the ambassadors. One thing I love walking around, you just see kids playing with kids. Kids don't care about race. Racism is a learned behavior. We, the adults, are teaching kids to be racist. So if we I'm not suggesting go walk around and sit around playgrounds watching kids. I'm not advocating that. But if we just sat back and looked at, kids, 3-4-year-olds, how they interact with people, color is just a thing. It's like if you look at, if folks have cats, the dogs, a dog could have a brown puppy, a white puppy, a gray puppy. They're all the same puppies. And I think that's where we kind of get back to these rudimental, understandings of race, that we're all just people. And we can learn that from kids.
Wow. So maybe we could end there. Thank you, Christopher, for an amazing presentation. We really do appreciate you being with us. And thank you so much.
No, Vicky, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Again, Mayor, Dr. Esses, Vicky, you've been a big supporter of me since day one. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.